Hello. Okay. All day long during those walks, I had been able to dream about what a pleasure it would be to be a friend of the Duchess de Guermantes, to fish for trout, to go out in a boat on the Vivonne, and, greedy for happiness, ask no more from life in those moments than for it always to be made up a succession of happy afternoons. But when, on the way back, I saw on the left a farm which was fairly distant from two others very close to each other, and from which, in order to enter Combray, one had only to go down an avenue of oaks bordered on one side by meadows, each of which was part of a little enclosure and was planted at equal intervals with apple trees that wore, when they were lit by the setting sun, the Japanese design of their shadows, my heart would abruptly begin to beat faster. I would know that within half an hour we would be home, and that, as was the rule on the days when we had gone the Guermantes way and dinner was served later, they would send me to bed as soon as I had had my soup, so that my mother, kept at the table as though they were company for dinner, would not come up to say good night to me in my bed. The region of sadness I had just entered was as distinct from the region into which I had hurled myself with such joy only a moment before. As in certain skies, a band of pink is separated as though by a line from a band of green or black. One sees a bird fly into the pink. It is about to reach the end of it. It is nearly touching the black. Then it has entered it. The desires that had surrounded me a short time ago, to go to Guermantes, to travel, to be happy, were so far behind me now that their fulfillment would not have brought me any pleasure. How I would have given all that up in order to be able to cry all night in Mamma's arms. I was trembling. I did not take my anguished eyes off my mother's face, which would not be appearing that evening in the room where I could already see myself in my thoughts. I wanted to die. And that state of mind would continue until the following day, when the morning rays, like the gardener, would lean their bars against the wall, clothed in nasturtiums that climbed up into my window. And I would jump out of bed to hurry down into the garden without remembering now that evening would ever bring back with it the hour for leaving my mother. And so it was from the Guermantes way that I learned to distinguish those states of mind that follow one another in me during certain periods, that even go so far as to share out each day among them, one returning to drive out the other, with the punctuality of a fever, contagious, but so exterior to one another, so lacking in means of communication among them, that I can no longer comprehend, no longer even picture to myself in one, what I desired or dreaded or accomplished in the other. And so the Méséglise way and the Guermantes way remained for me linked to so many of the little events of that life which, of all the various lives we lead concurrently, is the most abundant in its vicissitudes, the richest in episodes. I mean our intellectual life. No doubt it progresses within us imperceptibly, and the truths that have changed its meaning and its appearance for us, that have opened new paths to us, we had been preparing to discover for a long time, but we did so without knowing it. And for us, they date only from the minute in which they became visible. The flowers that played on the grass then, the water that flowed past in the sunlight, the whole landscape that surrounded their appearance continues to accompany the memory of them with its unconscious or obstructed face. And certainly, when they were slowly studied by that humble passer-by, that child dreaming as a king is studied by the memorialist lost in the crowd, that corner of nature, that bit of garden, could not have believed it would be thanks to him that they would be elected to survive in all of their most ephemeral details, and yet the fragrance of hawthorn that forages along the hedge where the sweet briars will soon replace it, a sound of echoless steps on the gravel of a path, a bubble formed against a water plant by the current of the stream, and bursting immediately, my exultation was born then, has borne them along with it, and managed to carry them so many years in succession, while the paths about have disappeared, and those who walked on them have died, and the memory of those who walked on them. At times, the peace of the landscape thus transported into the present detaches itself in such isolation from everything else that it floats uncertain in my mind like a flower de l'os. While I cannot say from which country, which time, perhaps quite simply which dream it comes, but it is most especially as deep layers of my mental soil, as the firm ground on which I stand still, that I must think of the Méséglise way and the Guermantes way. It is because I believed in things and in people while I walked along them, that the things and people they revealed to me are the only ones that I still take seriously today, and that still bring me joy. Whether it is that the faith which creates has dried up in me, or that reality has taken shape in memory alone, the flowers I am shown today for the first time do not seem to me real flowers. The Méséglise way, with its lilacs, its hawthorns, its cornflowers, its poppies, its apple trees, the Guermantes way, with its river full of tadpoles, its water lilies and buttercups, formed for me for all time the contours of the countryside where I would like to live, where I demand above all else that I may go fishing, drift about in a boat, see the ruins of Gothic fortifications, and find among the wheat fields a church, like Saint André du Champ, monumental, rustic, and golden as a haystack, and the cornflowers, the hawthorns, the apple trees that I still happen, when traveling, to come upon in the fields, because they are situated at the same depth, on the same level of my past, communicate immediately with my heart, and yet, because places have something individual about them, when I am seized by the desire to see the Guermantes way again, you would not satisfy it by taking me to the bank of the river where the water lilies are just as beautiful, more beautiful than in the Vivonne, any more than on my return home in the evening at the hour when there awakened in me that anguish which later immigrates into love, and may become forever inseparable from it. I would have wished that the mother who came to say good night to me would be one more beautiful and more intellectual than my own. No, just as what I needed so that I could go to sleep happily with that untroubled peace which no mistress has been able to give me since that time, because one doubts them even at the moment one believes in them, and can never possess their hearts as I received in a kiss my mother's heart, complete, without the reservation of an afterthought, without the residue of an intention that was not for me, was that it should be her, that she should incline over me that face marked below the eye, by which something which was, it seems, a blemish, and which I loved as much as the rest. So what I want to see again is the Guermantes way that I knew, with the farm that is not very far from the two that come after, pressed so close together at the entrance to the avenue of oaks, those meadows on which, when the sun turns them reflective as a pond, the leaves of the apple tree are sketched, that landscape whose individuality sometimes, at night in my dreams, claps me with an almost uncanny power, and which I can no longer recover when I wake up, no doubt by virtue of having forever indissoluble indissolubly united in me different impressions merely because they had made me experience them at the same time. The Méséglise way and the Guermantes way exposed me for the future to many disappointments and even to many mistakes. For often I have wanted to see a person again without discerning that it was simply because she reminded me of a hedge of hawthorns, and I have been led to believe, to make someone else believe, in a revival of affection by what was simply a desire to travel. But because of that very fact too, and by persisting in those of my impressions of today to which they may be concerned, they give them foundations, deep, a dimension lacking from the others. They add to them, too, a charm, a meaning that is for me alone. When on summer evenings the melodious sky growls like a wild animal, and everyone grumbles at the storm, because it is because of the Méséglise way that I am the only one in ecstasy inhaling through the noise of the falling rain, the smell of invisible, enduring lilacs. Thus I would often lie until morning, thinking back to the time at Combray, to my sad, sleepless evenings, to the many days, too, whose image had been restored to me more recently by the taste, what they would have called at Combray the fragrance, of a cup of tea, and by association of memories to what, many years after leaving that little town, I had learned about a love affair Swann had had before I was born, with that precision of detail which is sometimes easier to obtain for the lives of people who died centuries ago than for the lives of our best friends, and which seems as impossible as it once seemed impossible to speak from one town to another, as long as we do not know about these expedient by which that impossibility was circumvented. All these memories added to one another now formed a single mass, but one could distinguish still between them, between the oldest and those that were more recent, born of a fragrance, and then those that were only memories belonging to another person from whom I had learned them, if not fissures, if not true faults, at least that veining, that variegation of coloring, which in certain rocks and certain marbles reveal differences in origin, in age, in formation. Of course, by the time morning approached, the brief uncertainty of my waking would long since have dissipated. I knew which room I was actually in. I had reconstructed it around me in the darkness, and either by orienting myself with memory alone or making use as a clue of a faint glimmer that I perceived under which I placed the casement curtains, I had reconstructed it entirely and furnished it like an architect and a decorator who retained the original openings of the windows and doors. I had put back the mirrors and restored the chest of drawers to its usual place, but scarcely had the daylight, and no longer the reflection of the last ember of the brass curtain rod, which I had mistaken for it, traced on the darkness, as though in chalk, its first white correcting ray, then the window along the curtain would leave the door frame in which I had mistakenly placed it, while, to make room for it, the desk, which my memory had clumsily moved there, would fly off at top speed, pushing the fireplace before it and thrusting aside the wall of the passageway. A small courtyard would extend in the exact spot where only a moment before the dressing room had been, and the dwelling I had rebuilt in the darkness would have gone off to join the dwellings glimpsed in the maelstrom of my awakening, put to flight by the pale sign traced above the curtains by the raised finger of dawn. Part 2, Swann in Love. Woohoo!